Hey everyone, welcome back to WE3. I am Dylan Lockwood, Senior Editor at Zpryme, and here we're going to talk about water and energy in a rebuilding world. The COVID-19 pandemic has led to devastating job loss and economic downturn, while the effects of climate change have become increasingly apparent with wildfires and storms across the US. However, we have an opportunity in this moment to not only plan on returning to normal, but to make smart investments to make our utilities cleaner, sustainable, and more equitable. And here to discuss that with me are two great panelists that I'll allow to introduce themselves. Jody, we'll start with you.
Hi, thank you so much. Jody Allison, I am the Vice President of Transformation at Algonquin Power and Utilities, Liberty, and very excited to be here today. I've spent my career in many different businesses, so from manufacturing to retail to financial services, and joined the utility industry, energy, about 4 years ago, and it's been just an exciting ride. So very focused on customer and customer strategy and operations. So very excited to be here with you today.
I appreciate having you. And Ravi, why don't you introduce yourself?
Sure. My name is Ravi, and thanks for having me on the panel. I'm based in Singapore and US, and from Singapore, I run a company which is focused on building the next generation of water processing and products to help people provide sustainability by replacing plastic bottles with new kind of stuff. My career spans everything from medical devices all the way to technology, and then lately into water processing. And I'm glad to be here. Thanks.
Happy to have you both on. So, Ravi, I'm gonna start with you on the water side. How do you think that utilities can best determine, or not just utilities, how can anyone in this industry best determine where opportunities are in such a volatile, changing landscape?
Yeah, actually, we had, as a company ourselves, because we develop a lot of new products, we had to actually kind of slow down and ask ourselves, are we doing the right thing? Because as the COVID pandemic hit, everything kind of slowed down quite a bit. So instead of going and saying that we'll stop completely, we actually went back to our customers. And my customer base currently mostly is in Asia. And by working with them on almost like a consistent basis, even though I was in US at that time, trying to figure out what are the best products for when they're going to come out of the pandemic. So what we found very interesting in this pandemic was, and I give you a simple example of a city like Phuket in Thailand. Their typical summer traffic is a few million, and this year it was almost nothing. And what they realized during this time was how to actually set up their infrastructure. So when they come out of the pandemic, will they be prepared for it? So what we did was we actually worked very closely with our customer base to understand what they were looking for before the pandemic, how it changed, and then actually helping them rebuild the infrastructure to be prepared when they come out of
it. And Jody, from your side, more energy focused, how are you seeing people look for opportunities?
Yeah, I really will just add on to that. I agree. It's focus on the customer. What's going to deliver value to the customer? What do they expect? And I think a lot of those events that you have described have brought a lot of things to people's attention, and focus on sustainability. We have to listen to the voice of the customer. That's the primary driver. But we also have to think, in the olden days, people didn't say they would have told you they needed a faster horse when they probably needed a car. So we also have to look at areas of innovation and build on our strengths, and help them understand what's available to drive to some of those areas of sustainability. So, but it really does. It always starts with the customer, and you really have to understand what they perceive as valuable, and how do you deliver that.
So in light of everything that's been happening in 2020, does that mean that the decision-making process has changed for not only just determining where opportunities are, but for building investment strategies. Just to follow up, Jody.
Yeah, so I think, again, it really requires us to be prudent in our decisions, because the customers are feeling a lot of the pressures coming out of this, and it's very important that they can understand the value. So making sure that we're very good at understanding the decisions we make, how that's going to translate to a story around value, because the customers are feeling a lot of pressure. So from my perspective, that's where I think that's more important today than it's ever been.
And Ravi, how have you seen the decision-making process for future investment changing?
Yeah, sure. So we saw two things. One was utilities themselves. They realized very quickly that their workforce required to manage the infrastructure was changing constantly because of the situation in hand. So we saw them start looking at, as they come out of this pandemic, what should they put in place if something like this should repeat? What kind of operational systems should they have in place? So a big focus was, how do you enable the infrastructure using either newer technologies or add new technologies to the existing infrastructure? And because we also work with a lot of enterprises, both from our products perspective, and in Asia, typically enterprise large buildings happen to be very large customers of utilities, is to also understand how the enterprise model changed. For example, the building I'm in right now, it's only 35% occupied. So even though we still use the same amount of water, more of the water usage has moved to the house because most people are working from home than in the office space. So a lot of this water movement, or in this specific case, at least in Asia, this specific resource, which is water, has moved from office to home. And then it goes back and forth as people move back and forth into the buildings. So a lot of value people are driving towards now is, how do you actually create the database and amount of data to help decide how to actually change your infrastructure when required. So I would say mostly using technology as an enabling metric and figuring out how to actually build a better infrastructure. So that's the biggest change we have seen now. Previously, we never saw utilities actually talk about it, and now it's number one thing they're on their mind.
That's true.
Yeah, and so I want to know, and Jody, we can start with you. How do we sort of make the innovation process a bit more agile now that there's so many different confluencing, a lot of different factors, new factors coming together, a lot more, customer mindedness, a lot more external pressures, environmentally and financially due to economic circumstances, et cetera, et cetera. So with the way the processes currently are, a lot of times this can mean things get slowed up and innovation isn't happening as quickly. And so, and Jody, you have a background in finance, so I'm sort of interested in your perspective on how we can make this process more agile.
Yeah, so it's a great question, and I can think about this from many different aspects. So like, when you think about the approach, it's really about, design thinking, trying to make sure that, when we think about even agile methodology, like how we approach things and how we approach, whether it's technology projects or, lighthouse projects, it's really understanding how to do things in a very agile way, releasing that value as quickly as possible. It's not, and being able to have that feedback loop, that continual feedback loop because things are constantly changing. So how do we make sure that we iterate that into the process? So I think from that perspective, it's the approach and how we think through these things, and looking at leveraging, especially resources across the board. So how do we build off the understandings and knowledge that we have gained as an industry, and doing that very quickly. So I think a lot of times we can get caught up in overthinking, but really it's really about transitioning to that more agile way of going about things, whether it's how we manage, whether it's managing the business from an agile perspective, or it's managing from a technology, like how we go about thinking about technology projects and how to release value in a very quick way, to see quick wins early on. And we're currently doing that in our business, is trying to look at what can we pull forward in a project to be able to deliver that value early on. So I think that's really the key.
And Ravi, what are some practices you're seeing that have helped increase agility and innovation?
Yes, actually, it's a fantastic question. So one of the things, I came from a completely different industry. I was in technology and cloud, and when I realized and I entered the water business, it was a very custom business. So essentially, you build a $2 billion plant and support, let's say, 500,000 people. And those processes and plants take a long time. So one of the focus we came up with in terms of making an agile process was to, how do you take a product which requires customization or centralization and actually make it distributed? So we applied a lot of the skills we learned from technology and cloud, which is, you distribute processes, you distribute applications across the globe and use them where they're required. So our thesis was, you take large systems, break them onto smaller pieces and modularize them. So the thesis always has been, if you can build one car and make it well, then you can build a factory to make 1 million cars, rather than making one massive car which will carry 1 million people. So by doing this, what we have done is we have talked to our customers, brought them into the picture, understood their needs, and then programmed them into our modular solution. And not just us, but I think we are seeing this across the board. The industries are essentially embracing the idea of modular scalable solutions, rather than make one size which supports 500,000 people and hope those 500,000 people will be there when you're all done with it. And there are very good examples of this across the board. But I think from our perspective, it's always been collaborate with the customer, number one, enable as much as you can with technology so you can use historical data to make better decisions going forward.
Oh, go ahead, Jody.
Sorry, if I could just interject, because there's a great follow-up to that. I can give you an example in our business where that's exactly what we did. And apologies if I don't pronounce this right, but Sajwan microgrid project in California. It was a really cool project where we there is it's a microgrid, and it's a Berkeley research station, and it's about 4 miles of line in wildfire territory. And by putting solar and storage onto the site, we were able to take the line out of service during the wildfire season and keep the customer on power for all significantly lower cost, keeping the customer in mind, and installing, as opposed to installing covered conductor to the 4 miles of line. So and especially in an environmentally sensitive area. So when you talk about those smaller scalable solutions, in the winter when the line is back in service in the microgrid, it provides additional resilience to the whole network. So this project actually won an award in Canada just recently, and it's something to be really proud of. But it speaks to what you were just speaking to. So I thought that was a great example.
Yeah, I think that is a good example. So I want to touch on something you both mentioned, which is the importance of the customer in terms in terms of making sure they're involved in the process from the get-go. Ravi, you sort of laid that out earlier. Jody, I want to go a bit into that more in terms of how the I guess I'm trying to determine the cause and effect relationship, but on the customer versus the investment strategy. Like, is it more that you need to determine the best investment strategy for like operations, and then try and sell that to customers in a way that they'll not push back against it? Or is the idea that you need to maybe not crowdsource solutions as much as determine customer wants and then build an investment strategy based around that?
Yeah, and I think my perspective is you need to understand what the customer wants and then build the investment strategy around that. But I think it's not, exactly what the customer says. You really got to listen to what they're saying and where there's areas of opportunity, right? So it's about taking what they're giving you, which is the gift of here's what the problem is that I'm trying to solve for, and then how do you solve for that? So they may not tell you they need a microgrid. Like someone in California probably didn't say, hey, I need a microgrid and this is how it would work. It's here's the problem we have and here's the struggles and how do we solve for that? So it's really understanding and listening to that customer, and that's what's so critically important, is making sure that you're going to deliver something from an investment strategy that's going to actually be adopted and utilized by the customers. So from my perspective, that's extremely important.
Ravi, what do you think is a good way of building a, I guess, decision-making culture that best has that relationship with the customer? Like, is it just a communication strategy? Is it an organizational thing? How would you go about setting up that relationship?
Sure, I think Jody said it very well. So I believe at the end of the day, at least when it comes to utilities, infrastructure, customers make emotional decisions. I mean, I always tell people, if no one pats you on the back, that means you didn't have a problem. So it's essentially, that's what happens to utilities. They deliver a great service. Utilities do an amazing job, but you only hear complaints because it happens once in that blue moon that people get affected. So I've always believed that utilities is an amazing business and what they can deliver 99.9% of the time. But where I believe they can do better is essentially what we call service delivery and management. Because ultimately if the customer remains engaged and has the data set and provides the information to the utility, that engagement becomes much more fruitful. So I think service delivery and management, which is ultimately a definition of customer satisfaction. And on the other side would be to provide that great delivery and management, then you need to have these data information across your system to say, how do I create the right amount of optimized capital, optimized human capital for operationals, and so on and so forth. So at the end of the day, I think it always comes down to the usage from a customer perspective, and then making sure that you have that information in your system to be able to historically map how the system is being used. And then that allows you to make the processes better. And ultimately, the more modular and scalable you are, like the microgrid example, you know that you can make the network more redundant and be able to handle peaks much better. So ultimately, it's all about customer data, and the more intelligence you put into this data, the better your network is going to operate, and ultimately everyone will be happy, including having profitable outcomes for the utilities.
So this is all really important stuff. Trying to shift more towards customer centricity is something that utilities have been discussing to various degrees over the past couple of years. But as we sort of established at the top of the panel, things are either changing or accelerating as a result of, a lot of different changes, but specifically because of the pandemic. Jody, how have customer expectations changed as a result of the pandemic, at least in the energy spaces you're seeing?
Well, I think in the energy space, it's, the pandemic forced a large amount of customers to move to interacting with the different businesses electronically much faster and at a much greater rate than we ever anticipated. So I think, were all of the businesses ready for that? I don't think so. And, you talk about data and insights. I think from the perspective that a lot of people are suddenly using, electronic methods to be able to interact, which, let's face it, weren't probably designed or at the level that a lot of the industries that they're interacting with are at. So now we have this, great point about we deliver we deliver great service, and the only time we hear things sometimes is when something is disrupted. But same thing, it's like suddenly people are realizing, hey, this is definitely not the experience I get when I interact with other businesses and other industries. And so I think that this is really you talk about, I give the utility space a lot of credit because I've spent a lot of time in financial services before I moved to the industry, and I've seen a lot of growth in this area in a very short period of time. But unfortunately, the investments in the infrastructure need to escalate as well to keep up with, people will use the phrase an Amazon-like experience. I can soundly say there's a lot of utilities that, they're not there. And so the pandemic has really forced that to light. And I think that this is the area where we have a huge opportunity. You think about customer centric. Well, that means self-healing grid. That means it means having the opportunity. What if we could tell a customer, hey, your power is going to be out, there's a storm coming, and you're probably going to need access to some sort of energy. So here's where you can go, and this is what you can do. Those are the types of things. Having data that tells us where those critical touch points are in the grid, so that if we have people with medical concerns or other types of needs that are critical when you have events, using data to be able to make those interactions seamless and take that manual work out of those processes. So I think there's a lot of opportunity when we say customer centric. There's a lot of opportunity, and we have a long way to go. And I think the pandemic has really forced that to light, just in some of the back office processes, as we've seen people wanting to interact in different ways, because they weren't able to get out and maybe go to the utilities office or do things the way that the resources weren't there to be able to staff to be able to respond to some of these things. So I think that's a huge awakening in that particular area.
I think you're right. And Ravi, are you seeing similar? Are you seeing similar movement in the water industry in your neck of the woods?
Oh, absolutely. In fact, I think Jody reminded me of a great story. So we worked very closely with a hotel where they actually use some of the equipment we've developed. And before the pandemic, the focus used to be, can we deliver enough water to all the customers? And quite how much does it cost doesn't matter. And then obviously they discharge the water into the sewage, and then obviously they get charged for it. But when the pandemic hit, suddenly the hotels had no occupancy. And at that point, they realized that the cost of discharge was so high that it became actually a line item for them to look at. What do we do to make sure that the cost goes down when we come out of the pandemic? So there's been a lot of effort from a customer perspective. In this case, it's an enterprise customer trying to understand finally the line item of what a utility is, not just paying a bill and forgetting about it, but how to make it a part of their business process. A lot of times, even in our homes for that matter, we never think of utility as a part of somehow a part of our budget. Actually, we just believe that we just write a check and go away. But the key event here is that the cost of utilities over a course of time will keep going up. And the question is, it's bad, not just for the customer, but for the grid, because the grid has to now overcompensate for this use cases, which are now changing. In this case, people working from home, or people utilizing more water at home than they were when they were actually working inside a building. So we see a lot of people thinking from that perspective now. And all this comes back down to letting the customer give you some data, using that to make smart decisions on your grid or your water infrastructure, and then using that information to actually bring back a better service for the customer by delivery mechanisms and or cost optimization.
Thank you for that. So I want to start moving in to talk about technology a little bit. I've got some questions on that, but I wanted to ask some related questions that have come in through the chat about technology. First, Ravi, to follow up on your example earlier about work you've done in Phuket, Thailand. Michelle wants to know what sort of recommendations did you make to Phuket on infrastructure modification to be better prepared for the return of tourism, presumably post-pandemic?
Sure. So their specific use case was that during summertime, even though they get a lot of rain, they didn't have a harvesting infrastructure where they could store some water, pull some water from the sea, clean it up, and during the tourist season, or what they call the high season, be able to provide enough drinking water, both for the parts of the city and then remote areas. So what we proposed to them is a combination of a desal with what we call point of use processing devices. So the idea was you only run these devices when you need them. So this is not a very expensive, massive infrastructure where it'll take many years to build. What typically would take, maybe a year or two to do can be done in less than 2 months. And it's almost like an on-demand water cleanup system, which can even be made portable inside a container. So the ideas we came up with, and they've not been implemented, but the ideas we came up with simply was a containerized mobile system, and maybe a few of these strategically positioned near the shortage points, and then turning them on and off based on use. Very similar to what Jody was mentioning about the microgrid. You just make these as redundant, provide additional resiliency, but the thesis simply is it's on-demand use. It doesn't have to run all the time. Brings down the cost of the system. They don't have to build any special infrastructure, and it's available when they need
it. And another question that came in, this one is for Jody. Do you see more electrical transmission lines being underground?
There's engineers that work in our business that are probably a lot smarter than I am that could probably answer that question. I think there is opportunity to certainly put lines underground. I think it's cost, right? Like it's going to come back to cost and the value that's perceived by the customers and being able to get that investment over the line. So I think when it comes to, we talked about microgrids and some other things, it seems like there's probably some other things that are going to make a little more sense maybe, but again, I can certainly follow up on that, but it seems like there's probably a lot of opportunities, and that's probably not going to be the first one, depending on the value delivery versus our outage rates are so low, but it'd probably be hard to make that justification.
Right, that makes sense. But what are some of the smartest investments utilities in energy are or can be making at this time, do you think?
Yeah, so I'll follow up with that. I think that if you heard the commentary through this discussion, a lot of it is centered on data and insights, and it's really about, to me, upgrading the infrastructure to really be able to have the ability to produce those data and insights. A lot of us struggle with very antiquated environments that don't allow us to create those particular views so that we can make better decisions and help our customers and be that customer-centric partner that people expect. So I think from our perspective, we're spending a lot of time and energy upgrading our infrastructure. We're using process automation, trying to make sure that we have the ability to use our resources wisely so that they're doing the most valuable activities. And like I said, we have a huge investment in our infrastructure right now underway. It's called Customer First, and it's really about laying the capabilities to be able to use those data and insights to get to the place that I talked about, where we have the opportunity to anticipate our customers' needs instead of respond, and do some of the really cool innovation work that like the microgrid that I talked about, and really have the information to be able to put together in a very agile way the solutions that we need. So from my perspective, I hope to see a lot of investments in people, making sure that their infrastructure's able to create that type of environment, and certainly some of the solutions that we talked about a little bit earlier.
Ravi, we had a question in chat that I think you might have insight into. So do utilities face issues in getting the cost towards customer engagement approved from regulators?
So we see this as a two-edged sword. So I think rather than going to the regulators, I've always believed, and I've seen this, at least when I've talked to a lot of utilities in this area, it's been more about how do you make the customer's life better, and getting the data and getting customer engagement in place only makes the process better. So the regulators are actually pretty happy to look at it. The only thing is you have to have some sort of set of standards to say, what is privacy data and so on and so forth. And we see enterprises or large commercial enterprises embracing that much faster because they have a lot more money to make or lose compared to individuals at a home level. So what we see consistently is large enterprises being involved with the utilities in deciding the data sets required to actually make the engagement better. And then over the course of time, that I think once utilities embrace that, it will flow automatically towards the individual user. And I think one of the big things we see, at least in this part of the world, is traffic is really bad in certain cities where we work. And having this diagnostics data from devices flowing back to the utilities helps them decide how to place the operational workflow properly and where to place all their human capital to do repairs. That the customer actually appreciates a lot, and so do regulators, because that directly drives high availability for a lifeline service. So I think you just have to balance the equation on what is the data being used for. As long as it's being used to deliver a better service, there's very little pushback from the regulators or the utilities.
And Jody, we got another question in from Benjamin. With increased electrification, aren't we becoming more dependent on a single energy carrier and more vulnerable to grid disruption?
Like I said, there's engineers out there that are far smarter than I am, but I think from my perspective, I think when you talk about microgrid and some of the other things, I think our resiliency that's where we drive the greatest change in our ability to be resilient. So I think I guess I wouldn't necessarily think that the electrification, further electrification is necessarily going to lead us there, because I think there's options that are available to us, like when we talk about breaking it down and looking at things like that microgrid solution. I think it's going to be there's going to be options, and I think that I think that's one of the things our industry is faced with, right? So pipes and wires are one thing, and there's certainly opportunity for some competition otherwise. So, but I think outside of that, I think some of these alternative solutions are going to create resiliency, are going to also create better competition in the industry.
Yeah, I think that's right, and I think that I think that there are that there's a lot of opportunity for a lot of process change, which I think maybe is what the question is sort of getting at. And to that end, we've talked about how the the pandemic has affected customer expectations and customer consumption habits, and how that has affected the decision-making process for investment. But there are other internal factors in terms of like operations and that sort of thing. And I'm curious how the pandemic has affected that, and where there are smart investments that can be made, not just to address those immediate concerns, but also maybe future-proof, or at the very least using those challenges as a step to make your utility better now. And Ravi, I'll start with you on that.
Yeah. So I think one of the things we found out while this pandemic is still here, but in Asia it's doing a little better right now, is that it gave utilities time to actually understand the use cases and the issues they had to deal with, because their workflow was disrupted in many ways. So one of the things we saw very quickly being adapted here was payment processing, for example. The question was, no one is mailing a check. How do you do collections? That's a bigger, because it requires essentially human capital until now. So we're seeing the similar disruption we saw when landlines became cellular, where very few people could afford landlines in Asia, and then when cell phones came about, everybody had multiple of those. So that's one thing we are seeing definitely is investments being made in bringing the customer to the digital format, and then using that as a way to reduce the operational cost of the utility itself. Because ultimately, regardless of how sustainable, reusable, recyclable we are, it only makes sense if the utilities at some point have to make money. So rather than make money thinking that it'll come in 50 years from now because they have 1 million customers, how can they actually start making money from day one and helping them achieve that? So we see a lot of investments, I would say, in digitization of the water system. That includes smart meters and usage statistics within the building, kind of mapping the use cases based on irrigation versus water drinking versus shower, and using those numbers to figure out average use cases and then driving the infrastructure properly. That's one place. The other one which we have seen people have taken additional steps now is what we call creating incremental capacity based on the data they have collected. So rather than saying that we'll build a brand new plant, the question is, can we add more point of use devices which only come on and off based on use cases? That's a pretty large change we are seeing across the board in Asia. And the last one we are seeing, which is very fascinating, is this whole idea of managing the whole infrastructure on the cloud. Now, when you talk about how many companies are competing in this, there's only one large, for example, water company in Singapore or in Thailand, but they have hundreds of locations and they have hundreds of people parked everywhere with buses and vans to bring parts to these locations. And their big push now is, how do we manage the disruption if there is one, and also be able to be preventively maintain the grid, water grid, so it doesn't go down at all. So that's where we are seeing the biggest investments. Essentially, I would say any process that can use data as a way to drive efficiency, that's the biggest focus right
now. So are you talking about like automation of those processes? Are you seeing a bigger push for removing human interaction in a time when human interaction can be potentially deadly?
That's one part of it. I mean, payment processing is a classic example. I mean, making it contact. Everybody's doing contactless payment, and previously you physically went to an office to pay a bill. So everybody's doing everything over the mobile phone now. So there are a lot of drive towards putting apps together which are running on your mobile phones to make payments, for example, or informing the customer, if there's going to be a failure or if their water quality is bad. So all that communication channel which they're creating is all on the mobile network, or what I call an electronic system. And so that's one piece which is going on. But at the same time, the existing infrastructure they have doesn't provide them enough data to be making those decisions. So what they're also doing is adding processes in place which allow them to capture more digital information from the users or a use case, and then bringing that into the process to say, how do we automate it and reduce interaction?
Yeah, and if I could just add on to that, you know, Ravi, you talked about resources, capacity, and cloud, right? So when I talk about customer first, you know, in our business across the board, we are looking at, you know, a lot of uh, customer first is really 6 projects for us, and it's really around making a lot of digitization of process. It's really about, you know, looking at how we run the business more effectively from a resourcing perspective, creating capacity from an operations perspective, and then, you know, using cloud solutions to do so. So you can definitely see that's where a lot of emphasis is, and well needed. You know, the pandemic kind of brought a lot of that to light, but good short-term decisions that translate to great long-term plays. So we're spending a lot of energy, no pun intended, on, you know, moving those programs forward. Whether it's, you know, we have electric, gas, water, and wastewater, and so it's using those across the board for all of our platforms, and making sure that we have the right technology in place to be able to drive in all 3 of those areas.
Yeah. So Jody, if a good if a good customer-centric investment strategy is made now, you know, what will utilities start to look like, both on the other side of the pandemic and beyond?
Yeah, I think, and I think you actually helped highlight this earlier, and Ravi's talked a little bit about it, but it's really about today. You know, you think about it, the lights go on, people don't even think about it. The only time they really think about their utility partner is when something doesn't go as expected. Where I think customer centric takes us is to a place where, you know, we're anticipating their needs, and we're telling them things in advance. So we're telling them that there's a storm coming, and there's something that they can do. We're helping them figure out sustainable solutions and providing them with answers to, you know, a lot of people, how can I help? I see that there's a lot of change in climate and wildfires and things, and what's my role, and how does the utility, the energy partner, partner with them in that, and helping them, you know, whether it's understanding, you know, EV or anything else for that matter. It's being that partner, that trusted partner with them, as opposed to kind of the last thought that we can be sometimes today. So I think that's where I see the huge transition from where we are today.
Yeah, that makes sense. Ravi, my last question for you is about you know, something we sort of talked a bit about in prep, which is the role of, I guess, other utilities. Since we've, you know, talked about the customer, we've talked about technology, we've talked about partners, and we've talked about internal looking. So, you know, the final thing is about just how we as an industry can best help each other. How will inter-utility collaboration promote better strategies?
Sure. I'll get to that in a second. I just want to add one more thing to what Jody said. You know,
Oh, go for it.
when I go around the circuit here in Asia, and one of the things everybody understands very quickly here is that water essentially is a very limited resource. So my driving factor to almost all my customers is it's a resource, and the only way you can actually keep it alive forever is if we reuse, recycle, and recirculate. So a lot of the decisions they're making going forward are actually based on the fact, how can they actually implement those strategies by using either better data, better customer engagement, so on and so forth. So essentially what I've always, you know, when I've talked to utilities, it's all about, it's not a question of how much resource you can create. The question is, how much can you reuse and recycle? And as much as you can, it reduces the burden on the infrastructure to create just brand new stuff every day. Now, coming back to your question, the inter-utilities, what I found fascinating, and I think I see this more in Asia than in US, primarily because the US is a very large country, is utilities here actually talk to each other quite a bit. But what they lack right now is there's no, what I would call, common data set they can use to actually influence each other's operations. So we know at a higher scale that a lot of water is used to build electricity, and a lot of electricity is used to pump water. But besides the, Jody knowing this or I or some of us knowing that, I don't think the customer ever actually thinks of it that way. So I don't think the customer knows. The question at the end of the day becomes is if the utilities talk to each other and they know at what times of the day more water is being pumped versus what time of the day more electricity is being used, you can actually come up with some sort of a data set which allows both utilities to operate better, be more resilient, and actually have profitable outcomes for both. But I haven't seen that yet, and I'm sure it'll be there. And I think that only happens when you put together a data set which actually can be shared across utilities. Now, where we are in the process, I'm not sure about US, but we have tried to do that quite a bit in Asia. And what we see in Asia is enterprises embrace that quicker. So hotels want to know that information so they can go to the electric folks and say, look, I'm going to use less hot water this month, so I need to get a special rebate on that. So that becomes a driving factor for utilities then to talk to each other.
Thank you for that, Ravi. And it looks like we are over time. So I would like to thank you both for being here. Jody, thanks for being on and talking about the energy and finance side of things.
Thanks. Thank you very much. Appreciate the opportunity to be with you today.
Of course. And Ravi, thanks for showing us the water tech and managerial side.
Yeah, thanks, Dylan, and nice to meet you, Jody, and hope we'll do this again next year in Rio.
Yeah,
right.
hopefully.
In the same room.
Yeah, thank you, Dylan.
And for the rest of you, thank you for attending this session. The next session will be in about 15 minutes, so make sure to grab a coffee, tea, hit the bathroom, grab your water, do anything you need to do, and we'll see you shortly.
I thought we were supposed to do yoga in between, but I guess not.
I'm not sure. Check the agenda.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Have a good day.